Welcome to Falstaff Spotlight, your free audio sample of new and existing releases from Falstaff Books. We hope that you enjoy these samples and will visit us at falstaffbooks.com to pick up the full-length ebook or audiobook of the title that you see here. 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 Anyway, enjoy the sample. Thanks.
The Doomsayer Journeys, The Complete Adventures, written by Steve Wetherell, narrated by C.C. Hogan. Book 1, The Last Volunteer. Prologue. There are some who say the outcome of events within the universes can be predicted by a mathematical equation so complex that not even the most highly evolved life form could begin to comprehend it. They speculate that if we were better able to follow a breadcrumb trail of chemistry and physics, we could trace events back through endless oceans of randomity and land on a tranquil beach of predictability and purpose. A certainty principle, a master pattern. There are others who would call it naive, optimistic, and even arrogant to assume the universes could be dumbed down to a recognisable shape, and that all perceived patterns are imposed by tiny minds trying to humanise oblivion, that chaos and unpredictability are the very nature of existence. Both points of view have their merits, and the ensuing discussion between enlightened intellects of opposing opinions would doubtlessly make for a thrilling party. However, seeing as we have little time for high bar tabs and likely fistfights, we will bypass the philosophical route and head straight for the truth. Which is to say, there is an equation out there that defies the logic of the broadest human mind. In fact, there are many, but the one that interests us now is a formula which, if correctly understood, and if the right tools were present, could very well predict the exact course of a raindrop through a river. More importantly, however, the equation could tell us why the raindrop fell and what it was thinking at the time. But most importantly of all, this equation is the very reason the raindrop exists. It is called the universal theory, and once you get to know it, it is far friendlier than you might imagine. It prefers to be called Ted. Space, the Sentinel, and a man called Bip. Adjust your perspective to infinite. Now, readjust to the averagely astronomical. And finally, set your sights on the merely gigantically enormous. This is the planet Bursch, named ages ago after an astronomer who was enterprising enough to realise that no one had yet officially named the ground they were standing on. More practical people may have called their planet Earth, or even the ground, but those people have little imagination. Gigantically enormous is a particularly relevant term for this planet, not on an ultraversal scale, or even on a universal scale, but as far as this particular solar system is concerned, Bursch is the big cheese. Burly planets swerve to avoid it, and tiny moons hang around its orbit like barnacles on a warship. Even the resident gas giant is a touch intimidated. If we concentrate and wait patiently, we can see a tiny twinkle of light curve around the planet's shoulder. Drifting closer, and we can see that the light is reflected from a metal globe, a vessel of some kind, gliding along the blanket of stars like an ice skater's dream, hugging Bursch's exosphere like a shy child hugs its mother's legs. A small plaque on the side of the vessel reads SS Sentinel. Inside the globe it is dark and cold too, with a kind of lifelessness that can only be found in lodgings abandoned by even the most molecular of tenants. From outside, dwarfed by the girth of Bursch, the vessel seemed tiny and toy-like. From the inside, however, perspective reveals that the Sentinel is verging on the cavernous. The long, wide decks are only partially illuminated by the soft blue glow from the neighbouring planet. The only noise is the calm hum of unseen machinery, a whispered lullaby for a slumbering starship. On the inside wall of one of the many decks, staring out towards the vast vista of the galaxy, 8-foot-high pods stretch as far as the eye can see, their weighty oval shapes tracking the curve of the globe's interior far into the distance. Each one emits a light into the gloom that, even though the pods are very close to us, seems to shine distantly through a thick fog. The only blemish on these otherwise smooth capsules is a small indentation that allows us to see inside. Inside this pod is a man. In the eerie stillness and translucent glow, he looks very peaceful. Captain Finnegan dreamed. Technically, he shouldn't have been able to. The design of the chronostatic pod made the passing of centuries seem instantaneous to its occupants. But it is hard to contain a mind as broad and sharp as Captain Finnegan's. He dreamed of penguins. Slowly, but with an attitude towards urgency, a small light began to flick from red to green inside Finnegan's pod, harshly illuminating his clean-shaven face and giving him the appearance of a drunk in a disco. A gentle beeping noise began a soft but insistent monologue. It was the kind of beat that, while happy to be discreet at present, was promising to become a lot less patient and a lot more hostile if left unattended. Years of the finest training had prepared Captain Finnegan for this exact moment. Even so, the first word he uttered as he awoke was a slightly confused "Ma?" With a suddenness seemingly totally alien to the accustomed stillness, a green matrix of information began to scroll across the viewport of Finnegan's pod, juddering and beeping with urgent abandon. Blinking the weariness from his eyes, the captain began to process the situation, and with a growing sense of horror, he realised that nothing was as it should be. Like a layabout's nightmare, Captain Finnegan's alarm had gone off nearly a millennium too early. It might be prudent to point out that countless light years away from Birch and the Sentinel, in a very different time and place, a civilization was standing, somewhat reluctantly, on the cusp of a new era of peace and prosperity. The assembled world leaders were standing sheepishly, like a group of boys caught fighting by an irate mother, shuffling their feet and avoiding one another's gaze. They were waiting for a countdown that would change everything they had ever known. Since the beginning of their planet's history, there had been an ever-increasing love of war. Nations had never been more content than when bombing the living hell out of other nations. Oodles of political time and money went into merely looking for excuses to have a war. War was good. Everyone knew where they stood with the war, even if it was usually in a bomb shelter. Now, though, it was becoming evident that in order for them to save their entire planet from being blown to pieces or rendered uninhabitable by radiation, something was going to have to be done. The 100 Years arms race had left the richer countries with more nuclear warheads than libraries, and the crippling financial consequences had forced them to sell on excess nuclear arms to smaller countries. This had all seemed like a good idea at the time, until one day everybody had come to the uneasy realisation that nearly every country in the world, regardless of affiliation or financial power, had a more or less even supply of nuclear weaponry. The slow and horrible understanding that one paranoid dictator or one political misunderstanding could result in a war that, while lasting only a few days, could blow up the world several times over, began to sink into everybody's consciousness. And thus a referendum was proposed, and then discussed, and then scrapped, and then re-proposed, and eventually, after 5 years of cold sweats and sleepless nights, was signed by every king, queen, president and prime minister on the planet. It was a testament to the general mentality of this planet's people that the first thing politicians could all fully agree on was that the prospective fiery death of the entire population was not a good thing. And so, the world's government representatives stood rather dejectedly in the viewing area of the planet's largest spaceport, waiting for the pleasant electronic voice to finish the countdown that would signal the beginning of the biggest arms armistice in history. Billions watched through live satellite images as a fleet of more than 1,000 rockets began to take off one by one, each of them laden with nuclear warheads and other payloads of destruction. A cheer went up from the collective military and media personnel who had been assigned to chaperone the event. A few of the world leaders wiped a tear or two from their eyes. Whether from relief and happiness or from a deep sense of loss, no one could tell. Destined for outer space, the rockets would undergo a few years of very careful manoeuvring in orbit until they formed what the media had dubbed a massive ball of death. Further years would be spent welding these nuclear arms together to form the biggest man-made space artefact in the planet's history, a cluster of devastating weaponry just over a quarter the size of the planet's moon. Then, when all the weapons were in one comparatively safe place, a drive thruster would begin the bomb heap's steady journey towards a neighbouring sun, where, it was predicted, it would explode with a minimal amount of fuss. Hooray! Global security had advanced to the stage where only weapons of acceptable amounts of destruction were allowed, and the populace celebrated, glad that their problem now belonged to the seemingly uninhabited folds of outer space. It says something about this civilization's nature that a few months after the nuclear arms had been sent on their merry way, and it was reported that the massive ball of death was a substantial way off its intended course, no one really cared much. Now, let's get back to Bursch. This is the northernmost continent of Bursch, although some people are reluctant to call it a continent as they're not sure whether building a continent out of ice isn't somehow cheating. But it is a continent nonetheless, and it rests like a white toupee on the crown of the bulbous world. Those who bother to learn about this chilled wasteland call it the Ice Plains, because it is quite plain and made out of ice. And snow. There is also a lot of snow, but mainly ice. Nobody comes here, not just because it's a nasty place, but because it's a nasty place that is a bother to get to. No, nobody but the most bizarre and blubbery of creatures would inhabit this frosted stretch of soul-destroying wasteland. Therefore, it is quite surprising to see, nestled between two enormous mountains and teetering on the edge of a vertical cliff face, a quaint and surprisingly not ice-covered village. The village comprises of several dozen triangular houses, some thatched, some tiled, but all made from wood, bar a large dome on the side of the village closest to the cliff, which appears to be made entirely of snow. In contrast to this surrounding icy harshness, the area around the village is a stretch of lush green farmland and forest that climbs the sides of the mountains and stops abruptly near the cliff edge. Comfortably cuddled from the raging elements, the village is reminiscent of an inverted snow globe. This is the community of Cannock, an oasis of spring in an eternal winter. Hovering above and around the village is the reason Cannock hasn't been eaten by a glacier or snowed under in mere seconds. A haze of nearly transparent heat creates an effective greenhouse wall, keeping the harsher elements out and letting only the weak sunshine in. It's quite interesting to watch it in action. For instance, if you could follow the direction of a particularly cruel gale as it winds through the ice-plain mountains, past old Bacalac and the patient mother, you'd be surprised to see it disperse in a flash of warmth as it hit the almost invisible barrier of shimmering heat that surrounds Cannock. So, too, if you looked up at a vengeful snowstorm plummeting angrily from the sky, you might be impressed to see it transform, with a barely audible fizzing sound, into a gentle summer rain. And so, thanks to the heat shield, it was on a warm spring day that Bip Plunkerton stepped back to look at his accomplishment. He removed his small half-moon glasses to see if what he was looking at was indeed actually there, and not just some terrible trick of the light. A familiar sense of general disappointment crept over him. He turned to his friend Michaelmas, who was gaping at Bip's handiwork and looking as though he was attempting to cry and laugh at the same time. The portly man walked around the construction, scratching and shaking his balding head in a mixture of amazement and disgust. "My wife is going to kill me," he finally said. "Sorry, Michaelmas," said Bip. "I don't know what went wrong." No, you never does. But I think I can give you a hint, right?" Michaelmas walked back to Bip and put a burly arm over his smaller friend's shoulders. "What I said, right, was, Bip, if you're needing some practice with that science of yours, why don't you do us a favour and turn that crumbled old garden shed of mine into a conservatory for the wife, yes?" And you says, "No problem, Michaelmas, my friend. It's the least I can do, what with you being such a good friend and all." Bip opened his mouth to speak. He wasn't sure that was exactly how the conversation had gone. His potential protest, however, was cut short by Michaelmas's litany. "Grand," I says, "and I lets you work your hocus-pocus on me garden shed, which me old grandpappy built with his bare hands, I might remind you, and what I get is not a conservatory, is it?" Bip shook his head. There was no denying it. It definitely wasn't a conservatory. "No, Bip, it isn't," continued Michaelmas. "What you did, instead of turning my garden shed into a conservatory like I asked, you turned my garden shed and my entire house into a bloody igloo." Bip nodded in dumb agreement. Where before had stood a modest, hand-built wooden house with a lovely thatched roof, now stood a rapidly melting igloo. "Sorry, Michaelmas," he said. "I don't know how it happened." "No, you never does," said Michaelmas, running a hand across his suddenly tired-looking face. "I'm going to have a tough time explaining this one to the council. And then there's the wife." He groaned. There was always the wife. Bip cleaned his glasses thoughtfully for a moment. "Well, maybe I can try and—" "Oh, no," interrupted Michaelmas. No. Do me a favour and don't do me no more favours." He stopped and sighed, taking in the slump of Bip's shoulders and the defeat in his eye. "Look, mate, you've got talent, and that's no lie. But you're going to need a hell of a lot of practice if you want to make your apprenticeship this year. The scientists ain't just interested in talent. They need reliable men. Men who ain't suddenly going to turn their houses into igloos." I know, whined Bip. "I just don't know why this keeps happening to me. They're never going to let me be a scientist if I can't do a simple restructuring equation." He kicked the igloo in frustration, resulting in a shower of ice. "Tell you what, mate," said Michaelmas. "You bugger off and get some practice in, and I'll get a councilman or an elder to sort this out. I'll blame it on Vandals or something." Bip frowned. "What? Vandals turned your house into an igloo? You got a better idea?" "No, Vandals it was, and Vandals it shall be. A practical joke by some young upstart is what I'll tell 'em." He rubbed his moustache thoughtfully. "They've no reason not to believe me. Stranger things have happened. Remember when Byron's cows tried to storm the town hall? Pip nodded in recollection. What had become to be known as the Great Bovine Rebellion had ended firstly in riots, then mainly in stake. In a community where people often tampered with the very fabric of nature, phenomena such as super-intelligent livestock were a commonplace occurrence. Thanks, Michaelmas. If they find out I'm practising science without proper supervision, they'll have my guts for garters, said Pip. No problem, lad. But if you're going to practice, then, do it elsewhere, would you? I don't need no more home improvements, if you get my drift. Pip nodded and ambled off, leaving Michaelmas to stare at what had formerly been his house. Captain Finnegan reviewed his crew in an emergency assembly on the foredeck of the Sentinel. Everyone was present, still bleary-eyed from the abrupt ejection from chronostatic sleep. Looking out over the crowd of nearly identical grey and yellow uniforms, Finnegan cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began rather lamely, "it appears that we have been activated far before our estimated crisis intervention deadline by what appears to be an unexpected crisis of our very own." The crew began to murmur until a man to Finnegan's left hushed them to quiet. Finnegan continued. "The situation is as follows. A large spherical metal object of unknown origin has struck the ship. While there is no major damage to life support or the primary structure of the ship, we have, I regret to say, been knocked out of orbit." A harassed-looking woman in the crowd raised her voice. "So we're hurtling out into space, then?" "Not quite, no, not really," said Finnegan. The crew let out a collective sigh of relief. "We are, in fact, hurtling towards the planet's surface." He gestured to the giant hollow screen behind him, where the planet Birch waited like a blue and green fist. The crew gazed at their fate with carefully blank expressions. The fact that they didn't begin shouting and screaming in a general panic said a lot about their nature. The same harassed woman floored another question. "Shouldn't we just use the manoeuvring thrusters, then?" There was a more positive murmur of agreement from the crew. "Ah, good question, that. Good observation," said Finnegan. "But I'm afraid that's the problem, you see. The actual aforementioned metal sphere is, in fact, lodged in our main engine, causing, let's say, a bit of a mess in the fuel ducts. Any attempt to utilise the manoeuvring thrusters, or any other means of propulsion for that matter, could very well result in us being blown to smithereens." Once again, Finnegan surveyed the rows of expectant faces. There were some times when being a captain wasn't an easy job. At the moment, he was hard-pressed to think of a time when it had ever been easy. A technician put his hand up to speak. "No disrespect, sir, but, you are elite gifted, sir. Couldn't you just, I don't know, convince the metal object it doesn't want to be lodged in the engine?" He finished, carefully probing the electric fence of fate, hoping to avoid a nasty shock. Captain Finnegan smiled broadly. "Very good," he said. "Very good indeed. A superb suggestion. Alas, it wouldn't work. The problem being, you see, that if we by any means remove the sphere, it would leave a dirty great hole in the ship that might cause us all to implode." The expressions of the crew turned slightly blanker. The technician spoke again. "Is there any chance we could repair it?" Captain Finnegan clapped his hands together. "You really are a keen one, aren't you? Repair it? Yes, of course. And you chaps are just the sorts to do it, aren't you? With your tools and your mechanical ingenuity and whatnot. But I have to ask, to be on the safe side, how long would you think it would take?" "Well," began the technician, rolling his eyes towards the ceiling in a manner common to all mechanics across the Ultraverse. repairing the main engine and the whole breech. If I got all the lads involved and worked straight through, we could get it repaired in, say, 7 hours? 5 if you wanted a rush job." Finnegan whistled through his teeth. "That's a damn pity, he said. "Because, you see, we have less than 2 hours before we hit the planet's surface." The harassed woman looked thoughtful for several seconds, before flooring another question. "Well, that's a bit of a bugger, isn't it?" she asked. There was a general murmur of agreement.